Wonderful. I'm going to kick us off. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this launch webinar where we're launching new research that's been led by Professor James Cockayne. James is Professor of Global Politics and Anti-Slavery in the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, and his research expertise and background is really deep and wide-ranging. It includes the theory and practice of global politics as it relates to modern slavery, organised crime, the financial sector, slavery as a sustainable development challenge. Some of his previous research includes the large project and report Developing Freedom, which answered the question, how can fighting slavery contribute to sustainable development? Another project and accompanying outputs called The Energy of Freedom, which was from earlier this year, and that examined the risk of forced labour in the supply chains of the solar industry. As well as his role in the Rights Lab, he's been chair of the US Council on Foreign Relations Study Group on Trafficking in Persons, and he also founded Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, the FAST initiative, in order to help mobilize the financial sector against this issue. The research we're launching today comes from a project that James has led over the past year about Xinjiang sanctions, and it seeks to answer the question, can economic sanctions address Xinjiang forced labour? It's produced 3 original data sets. They contain over 12,000 data points. It's publishing a series of 10 policy briefs, 4 podcasts, and a main research study, a 100,000 word piece of original research titled Making Xinjiang Sanctions Work. Most of these outputs are available now at the project website for you to read. We will, I think, put that link in the chat for you. It's also behind us on our webinar backgrounds, and the long report will be there for you by later this week. The UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office provided the University of Nottingham, the Rights Lab, with funding that's been used towards the project. The FCDO didn't have editorial control or influence over the contents of the report or the associated other research outputs, and these outputs do not necessarily represent the views of the FCDO or Her Majesty's government. In a moment, I'm very excited to hand over to James. I'm going to ask him to talk us through this research. There will be a brief period for any questions from you. You're very welcome to send us those questions using the Q&A function, and you can do that whilst James presents or afterwards. Let me note that only we as panelists, James and I, will be able to see your typed questions. We won't be indicating who is asking that question when James answers it. And let me also note that the webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing this on the project website. So welcome again to everyone, and I'll now hand over to James and invite him to talk us through this research. James.
Thank you so much, Professor Trod, for that really lovely welcome and for your wonderful leadership of the Rights Lab, which has been a pleasure to be part of for the last couple of years. Can economic sanctions address Xinjiang forced labour? Many Western governments seem to think so. There are now over 250 government sanctions measures in place, including the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, travel bans, financial sanctions, and more in the works, with the EU considering a forced labour trade instrument. What's their impact? Are they preventing and addressing Xinjiang forced labour? With funding support from the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, a team I led at the University of Nottingham Rights Lab looked at this over the course of the last year, as Professor Trod has explained. Although mine is the only name you'll see on this work, it's the product of many people's input. Those people have chosen to remain anonymous due to the very real safety concerns involved in such work on this issue. My thanks, very heartfelt thanks, nonetheless go to them. From this research, we have, as Professor Trod explained, produced several different outputs, beginning with 3 data sets available for search and download now on www.xinjiangsanctions.info. They cover government measures, Chinese countermeasures, and corporate responses, and together include more than 12,000 data points. We supplemented this data gathering with extensive literature analysis and with over a dozen confidential interviews with policy and industry actors conducted according to a strict ethics protocol. From this, we've produced 3 analytic products that we're launching today. The main product is a major research report, Making Xinjiang Sanctions Work, which covers the topics you see on the screen there. I'll present the key findings in this presentation today. Due to a small technical hitch in production, the report isn't available on the website at the time we're broadcasting this webinar, but you'll be able to download it from tomorrow, Thursday, 28th of July at the website I mentioned earlier. Second, we've boiled the report's scholarly analysis down into 10 policy briefs, each between 2 and 4 pages long, and you can download any of them or all of them, the full set, from the website anytime. They're already there now. And third and finally, to bring this content to life, we've recorded 4 podcast episodes with 5 of the leading experts on these issues under the title Xinjiang Sanctions. You can access these episodes through the site or through leading podcast apps and platforms. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to summarize the key findings in the 4 sections of our policy report, Making Xinjiang Sanctions Work. I'll start with part 1, Understanding Xinjiang Forced Labor. Xinjiang means new frontier in Mandarin. The Chinese Communist Party has always seen the area as a frontier between barbarian forces to the west and the eastern Chinese heartland. Forced labor is a symptom of the way Beijing has chosen to govern that frontier. In the early days of the PRC, when President Xi Jinping's father Xi Zhongxun was the top CCP official for the region, the focus was on stabilization through land reclamation and gradual sinification. Forced labor played a limited role here as a source of agricultural and prison labor. Since 2014, under President Xi, the CCP's governance strategy for the region has shifted to social transformation. Mass forced labor is now a means through which the CCP pursues cultural assimilation of Uyghur and other minorities in the area and the rapid economic development of the region. And this has involved massive investment in the industrialization of the region, turning the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region into a key node in numerous global value chains, notably cotton, tomatoes, and solar panels. Now, some commentators describe this process as akin to the process of settler colonialism and racialized capitalism that produced slavery and forced labor in communities such as the United States and Australia, with long-term negative impacts for sustainable development. Since 2014, 2 key government programs have come to operate in tandem to generate forced labor. First, the Vocational Skills and Education Training Centers, or VSETCs, inside Xinjiang, and second, the Poverty Alleviation Through Labor Transfers program, which includes transfers into workplaces both inside Xinjiang and in other Chinese provinces. Together, these programs have put between 2 and 2.5 million people at risk of forced labor in recent years. Time doesn't allow me to explain each program at length in this presentation, but we do so in policy brief number 1 and in the main report. There are, however, several key implications that are worth spelling out here. First, each program intersects in different ways with different global value chains. So economic sanctions will create different forms of leverage in relation to each of these 2 programs and may require different due diligence and policy responses. Second, what drives CCP action in Xinjiang is not a narrowly economic or developmental nor a purely commercial logic. It's rather a political and strategic one aimed at transforming society in Xinjiang. So in assessing sanctions effectiveness, the key question isn't going to be whether sanctions change business practice, but whether they lead to change in government policy. Understanding how different businesses and sectors are likely to influence government policy, therefore becomes key. We explore all these themes at more length in our Xinjiang Sanctions podcast episodes with Jawa Ilham, Zumratai Arkin, and Dr. Adrian Zenz. That brings us to the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, or XPCC, a key instrument for the CCP leadership in Beijing to project and maintain power in Xinjiang, which we discuss in policy brief number 2. The XPCC has evolved significantly over the last 8 decades with Xinjiang's changing political economy. Starting out as a settler garrison, it's evolved into both a complex corporate conglomerate with 13 subsidiaries listed on Chinese stock markets and more than 862,000 holdings in 147 countries, and a state within a state. In 2021, XPCC production was about 25% of Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region GDP, and XPCC membership represented around 13% of the region's population. The XPCC has been involved in Xinjiang forced labor since close to its inception, but the form that forced labor has taken has evolved from prison labor and annual harvest corvée labor to a more industrialized system with ties to both the VSETC and poverty alleviation through labor transfer programs. As we'll see, the XPCC has been a central target of Western sanctions. But our research found that XPCC firms are not always as influential over government policy actors as maybe some other firms with ties to Xinjiang forced labor in the various sectors. The XPCC, in fact, receives a huge amount of budget support from Beijing, pointing to the strategic function that it plays for the CCP in Xinjiang governance. So for sanctions to be effective, there may need to be differentiation amongst XPCC targets based not only on their vulnerability to Western sanctions, but also their influence over government policy, a theme to which I will return later. Before discussing those Western sanctions, however, it's important to say a quick word about the legal implications of how we understand and characterize the conduct that sanctions are targeting. Clarity on the legal violations that sanctions seek to cure makes those sanctions more effective and helps with targeting. And relying on different norms may open up or indeed close down different remedial pathways. For example, one of the most unexpected findings from our research may be that characterizing events in Xinjiang, specifically in terms of forced labor, may actually make it harder under international law to justify the use of unilateral trade measures such as import bans. We explained why this is the case at some length in policy brief number 3. But it turns out there are a range of other legal norms that may be relevant, some of which may actually give a stronger case for use of unilateral trade measures. The table shown here, which you can, I promise, read more easily in policy brief number 3, shows how some of these norms can be applied. They include China's existing commitments under the UN's Palermo Protocol on Trafficking in Persons, and also its commitment to fight both slavery and compulsory labor under the 1926 Slavery Convention. The key point here is simply that the sanctioning coalition's legal justifications for their sanctions could potentially be strengthened and better harmonized through closer reference to global trade law and a broader range of legal norms, going beyond the ILO labor standards that are typically referenced today. And taking this approach might help inoculate import bans and other measures against later legal challenges by importers or indeed by China itself. With part 1 having introduced and explained the nature and concerns around the policies generating Xinjiang forced labor, part 2 of the study turns its focus to the response. Governments have adopted 239 measures in response to Xinjiang forced labor as of June 2022. 60% of these have been adopted by the United States. Canada, the UK, the EU, and the EU's EFTA partners account for the remainder. Import and export controls are the most numerous measures, but are currently focused in the US and Canada. Asset freezes and travel restrictions are being used by a broader set of countries. While the US has measures in place against 108 targets, elsewhere, the target sets are a small fraction of this size. 36% of all measures turn out to be targeted at just 4 individuals, senior CCP officials in Xinjiang, and 3 entities, including the XPCC. Now, import bans are increasingly popular as a measure, as we explore in a couple of our podcast episodes with Chloe Cranston of Anti-Slavery International and Anasuya Sham of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. The US has instituted bans on imports of a range of goods from Xinjiang, and since the 21st of June of this year, under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, has applied a rebuttable presumption that supply chains passing through Xinjiang are tainted by forced labor. So importers will have to provide clear and convincing evidence that the goods that they are seeking to import were not made in whole or in part with forced labor if those goods include components from Xinjiang. The value of shipments detained by US authorities under those kinds of Tariff Act import bans has increased significantly in recent years, from $0.218 million in FY 2018 to $227 million for the first 6 months alone of financial year 2022. And enforcement is expected to increase now that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is in place as well. Canada has a similar import ban in place and has begun enforcing it, but in to much lesser extent. Australia and the EU are contemplating adopting similar arrangements, and some countries have also adopted various export controls, guidance for business, and other measures that we detail in the report, and indeed in policy brief number 4. Another of the key surprises from our research, though, is just how big a disconnect there is currently in Western policy between imports and investments. Several jurisdictions have limited banking and asset freeze measures in place for certain entities connected to Xinjiang. The US has also imposed investment controls on a relatively short list of technology companies, but by and large, there is nothing stopping Westerners investing in the same firms whose goods are being blocked at the US border because they're thought to be made with Xinjiang forced labor. Indeed, for example, late last year, it was reported that US climate envoy John Kerry had personally invested through a fund in 2 Chinese firms with reported ties to Xinjiang forced labor, one of which had its solar panels stopped by US customs, the other of which was on the US export control list. There was absolutely nothing illegal in this. Indeed, US holdings of Chinese securities surged 57.5% from $765 billion in 2017 to as much as $1.2 trillion in 2020. Looking just at Xinjiang, Vanguard's investments specifically reportedly tripled between 2018 and 2021, just in Xinjiang, the same period that forced labor was becoming a mass phenomenon there. And institutional investors outside of the US, of course, own shares and other positions in many Chinese firms sanctioned by the US. There are, in fact, only a few investors undertaking active engagement with firms exposed to Xinjiang through supply chains, though the work of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights is critical here. Shareholder action is in its infancy with just 6 proxy proposals in the last season, and portfolio divestment is also rare at this stage, though Yale University is reportedly considering it. In fact, rather than contest ties to Xinjiang, some Western institutional investors, such as BlackRock, appear to have voted in favor of motions noting invested firms' participation in government-run programs with known ties to Xinjiang forced labor. We can, however, probably expect investment to become more of a flashpoint on this issue. The European Parliament has already signaled its willingness to consider restricting such investment, and the United States Congress is beginning to consider screening of investment into China. Beijing, though, clearly thinks it has leverage over the West through Wall Street and investors and is actively wooing them, as we explain at more length in the report. That's not all that the Chinese government is doing to contest the impact of these measures. It's developed a complex set of formal and informal countermeasures. These include the Chinese government's own entity list, a Ministry of Commerce order, and a formal anti-sanctions law from mid-2021, I should say. We explain these in more depth in Policy Brief 5 and the main report, and you can find more details on these formal measures in one of the data sets on the website. These formal measures are in fact modeled on related laws in the EU, UK, and Russia, but operate rather differently, as we explain. They give the Chinese government almost unfettered discretion to take action against individuals and entities that the CCP feels are threatening Chinese internal affairs or national security, and have been used to sanction targets in 14 jurisdictions. The study in Policy Brief number 5 also looked beyond these formal sanctions, however, to a range of informal countermeasures, including fomenting online and commercial boycotts, strategic regulation, and informal blacklisting. The Chinese government has applied these techniques over the last 2 years to an array of targets it considers to be peddling the false Xinjiang forced labor narrative. These have included individual scholars, research bodies, apparel firms, and even Intel and Walmart. Now, our analysis discusses how these informal countermeasures work and the impacts they've had, and those have been substantial. Some Western clothing brands, such as Adidas, have lost over 20% of local market share in China to domestic and foreign competitors. And these measures have also succeeded in neutering third-party labour and social audit's ability to understand Xinjiang forced labour risks on the ground in China, not only within Xinjiang, but also elsewhere in China. Companies have responded to this situation in different ways, as our corporate responses dataset, which you can search and download from the website, show. It includes over 250 companies from 21 countries. Chinese companies facing this pressure from the CCP usually deny the fact or existence of Xinjiang forced labour. Western companies sometimes acknowledge it, but the most common response across all different jurisdictions in which companies are domiciled is silence. The corporate responses dataset also allows us to identify a range of other patterns in corporate responses, such as which companies are more likely to still be relying on third-party audits and how companies are responding to import bans. 4 points, all of which are spelled out in more detail in policy brief number 6, bear highlighting. First, for many firms, it remains business as usual. The costs imposed by Western sanctions are not sufficiently onerous to induce change practice and are leading some of them to explore active workarounds. That may, of course, change with enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act. Second, however, Western government policies do not currently proactively address businesses' costs of compliance, and there is a tendency at times to downplay those costs. Third, there are signs that this may be beginning to lead to regulatory arbitrage and social dumping of goods made with forced labour, a point I'll return to later. And fourth, Western governments may need to develop coordinated industrial and other policies to reduce businesses' costs of compliance and to develop alternative slavery-free supply chains if they want to see these sanctions really take effect. This brings us to part 3 of the study, which looks at how Xinjiang sanctions are playing out in 3 specific sectors: cotton, tomatoes, and solar. We begin, though, by using sanctions theory and trade theory to develop an analytical framework for understanding these dynamics and impacts. We identify 5 key questions relating to sanctions design, impacts, and targets. First of all, do the sanctions strengthen opponents of use of forced labour relative to proponents of use of forced labour? Sanctions aim to induce policy change. Some sanctions targets have more influence over policy than others. So the aim should be to strengthen the position of those actors that support the policy change you want to promote and weaken the position of those who oppose it. The second question is, do sanctions exploit cost asymmetries? In other words, are the costs created by the sanctions higher for the sanctions targets or for the sanctions senders and their firms? As we'll see, one of the most important and surprising conclusions from our study is that this is not the case for some of the Xinjiang sanctions in place. In fact, they may currently impose higher costs on Western importers and buyers than on Xinjiang producers and exporters, a point I'll come back to. Third, how do targeted entities adapt? Through trade reallocation, shifting exports to other markets, through deflection, rerouting through third markets, or through product transformation, changing the nature or components of the product so that it's no longer subject to the sanctions in the first place. Fourth, what role do sectoral bodies play? And the fifth question we asked is, are capital markets engaged? And this is particularly important in the Chinese context because capital is the scarce factor of production in China. And sanctions theory tells us that if you sanction the scarce factor of production, you're more likely to succeed than if you sanction a factor of production that is not scarce. So using these, this framework, we analyzed the dynamics of sanctions in the cotton, tomato, and solar sectors. Again, this is a summary of our findings, and that figure appears on the back page of policy briefs 7, 8, and 9, available on the website, and you can peruse it at greater ease and leisure there. But let me summarize the key findings in each of these sectors for you. First, we look at cotton, and you can read about this in policy brief number 7. This is the sector in which Western sanctions are having the clearest economic effects. Xinjiang cotton prices are down and inventories are up as demand for Xinjiang cotton dries up. Western sanctions may be working because the cost for Xinjiang cotton producers and adjacent industry firms to reallocate trade to new buyers are higher than the cost for Western importers and buyers to find new supply. That is a result of the structure of the global cotton market and the elasticity of supply. Now, an EU import ban, if it happens, will strengthen these structural effects as it would increase the share of global demand boycotting Xinjiang cotton. So too, though, would the involvement of the Central Asian states that import significant quantities of Xinjiang cotton. And since those countries are also producers of cotton, this may be in their domestic industry's interest. Some firms exposed to Xinjiang cotton supply are, however, splitting their supply chains in two, which is called bifurcation, using Xinjiang cotton for most goods, but not for goods bound for the US. This remains a little bit of a Western sanctions policy blind spot, since Western consumers may be cross-subsidizing the production of these goods for other markets by paying these same firms a premium for slavery-free goods that those firms are still allowed to import into the sanctioning markets. They can then use that premium to pay for the use of forced labor to produce goods for other markets. Now, sectoral bodies have played important roles in promoting labor standards, but they risk becoming politicized as a result. In the study, we discuss the implications and how this could risk accelerating economic decoupling. Capital markets. Some investors have begun actively engaging firms that may be buying Xinjiang cotton, but many Western investors, in fact, remain invested in Chinese entities with close ties to the Xinjiang cotton sector. In the report and the policy brief, we consider how target selection could be strengthened, suggesting a need to consider firms such as the Ruyi Group that may be both more vulnerable to sanctions than those currently targeted and more influential over policy than the entities sanctioned to date. Next, in policy brief 8, we look at tomatoes. Xinjiang accounts for around 18% of global trade by volume in processed tomato products, such as tomato paste and tomato sauce. Much of that goes to Europe, especially Italy, where it's modified and re-exported to Western markets and buyers, including to fast food retailers and agri-food giants, such as, but not limited to, Kraft Heinz, Unilever, PepsiCo, and Nestle. There's little evidence to date of sanctions significantly impacting firms in the Xinjiang tomato sector, nor of policy change in this sector, nor of remedy for victims of forced labor in this sector. In fact, to date, only the US has specifically targeted this sector, and there's been limited enforcement activity. Xinjiang tomatoes appear to still be entering North American markets. There's only limited evidence of Western buyers ceasing to buy products containing Xinjiang tomatoes. US financial sanctions have in this sector led to some firms with ties to the XPCC being dropped from global indices, but capital market engagement is otherwise very limited. Again, here for this sector, in the report, we suggest ways to improve target selection, for example, through considering sanctions on COFCO Tunhe, the major state-owned enterprise involved in the Xinjiang tomato sector. However, that also brings considerable risks, which we discuss. And another risk in this sector is social dumping. As more jurisdictions adopt import bans and enforce them on Xinjiang tomatoes, trade will be reallocated to other markets where labor standards are not being enforced on imports. This social dumping may place local producers at risk, as it already has in West Africa. This could, however, be used to recruit a larger group of countries into the sanctioning coalition to ensure that their industries are not so affected, including countries from Africa, Latin America, and potentially the Middle East. Third, in policy brief 9, we look at solar, specifically Xinjiang's involvement in silica and polysilicon production. Around 45% of global polysilicon capacity is now located in Xinjiang. We explain the sector's connections to forced labor, notably through the labor transfer scheme. While Western industry actors warn of major disruptions worth billions of dollars in the US, there is in fact little sign of concerted economic impact in Xinjiang. Prices for Chinese polysilicon are at 10-year highs, and there are as yet no clear signs of policy change or remedy for victims of forced labor in the sector, although again, it may be considered early days. However, what we found in this sector is that cost asymmetries from sanctions strongly favor Xinjiang producers and work against Western importers. It is more costly for Western buyers to find new slavery-free sources of supply than it is for Xinjiang producers to find new buyers of their products. New polysilicon production facilities typically cost more than $500 million US and take 18 months or so to bring online. We do already see evidence of Xinjiang producers engaging in trade reallocation, some trade deflection via Southeast Asia, and rapid product transformation leading to supply chain bifurcation. In this sector, dominant Chinese firms in the middle of the global supply chain are increasingly using their know-how, their business relationships, and their access to capital to develop new slavery-free supply chains to serve Western markets, without, however, giving up forced labor production for some products that they are going to sell to other markets, including into China. So like the cotton sector, this raises serious crop subsidization concerns. Western investors also remain significantly invested in the Xinjiang solar sector. Development finance bodies, interestingly, are the most engaged in addressing forced labor risks in this sector, though there are some signs of engagement by institutional investors and private equity. Very little sign yet of shareholder actions or delisting efforts. For this sector too, we offer some ideas on strengthening targeting selection. Sanctions could be strengthened by adding a focus on high quality quartz exports from the US to China, where Xinjiang polysilicon producers may be vulnerable and cost asymmetries seem to favor the sanctioning coalition. Another option is to more deliberately target industry leaders with influence over policymakers, such as solar firms with ties to the Xinjiang clique, or those with ties to Deng Xiaoping's family and the PLA. Critically, reducing the cost to Western business from complying with solar sanctions will be necessary to ensure continued support for these sanctions. This will require development of coordinated transnational industrial policy to increase alternative supply of slavery-free polysilicon. We offer some ideas for this in the study earlier mentioned by Professor Trod, The Energy of Freedom, which you can find through the University of Nottingham Rights Lab website. Several cross-cutting findings also emerge in part 3. Of the 3 sectors studied, the one most clearly impacted by Xinjiang sanctions is the cotton sector. That's the sector in which the costs created by sanctions fall more on Xinjiang producers and exporters than they do on Western importers and buyers. And that's instructive for how we think about sanctions design elsewhere. In none of the sectors have Western sanctions yet led to clear signs of policy change, nor of remedy being provided to victims of Xinjiang forced labor. The advent and enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act could change this situation, as could the adoption of an EU forced labor instrument. In all 3 sectors studied, target selection appears to have been driven primarily by information adduced to governments about the ties between individuals and entities and Xinjiang forced labor programs. Targets do not appear to have been selected based on the influence that they can wield over the government policies and practices that underpin Xinjiang forced labor. XPCC connected firms and individuals have received the greatest focus. Other firms, which may in fact be more vulnerable to sanctions and indeed may have greater influence over Beijing policymakers, such as the Ruyi Group, Kofco Tunier, and solar firms with ties to the Xinjiang clique, have not yet been specifically targeted. In all 3 sectors, the sanctioning coalition could be enlarged by recruiting states whose local producers are vulnerable to Chinese social dumping as the result of import bans. Central Asian states in the case of cotton, South Korea in the case of polysilicon, and West African and Latin American states in the case of tomatoes. We also found that the success of import bans such as the UFLPA will depend heavily on enforcement strategies and resourcing. All three sectors show signs of emergent sanctions evasion. And finally, there's a marked difference between Western policy on Xinjiang forced labor in trade and investment. The significant leverage that both investment and capital market regulation afford for addressing Xinjiang forced labor hasn't yet been meaningfully wielded by policymakers, even if individual investors are beginning, in some cases, to actively engage firms they invest in. This is an interesting contrast to Russia. Western business has, to a remarkable extent, voluntarily withdrawn from business in and with Russia. Its willingness to withdraw from business with China, where many fortunes remain to be made, seems much less certain. Xinjiang forced labor thus stands in important ways as a test of the liberal character of international trade and finance. A successful defense of that character, and thus of human rights, will depend on finding ways to make Xinjiang sanctions work. And that brings me to the final part of the study, our recommendations. I'm just going to summarize them for now and encourage you to download and read policy brief number 10 if you'd like more detail. Drawing on sanctions theory, we argue that the sanctioning coalition should develop a clearer, more specific explanation of exactly what conduct is problematic and what steps need to be taken to bring China's conduct in conformity with its legal obligations, and thus the removal of sanctions. That's recommendation 1. In recommendation 2, we argue for developing a narrative that situates the desired change of policy in win-win terms. What we mean by this specifically is that changes to policy in Xinjiang should be understood as an effort by the international community to work with China to help it avoid the mistakes that the West made in the past, using forced labor and slavery for economic development. Evidence such as the UN University study Developing Freedom shows that forced labor in fact creates 10 drags on development, some of which last through generations, increasing poverty and even increasing the risk of armed conflict. And those drags leave us all worse off. So decoupling development from forced labor is a win not only for the local community, the local country, but for the global economy too. A win-win narrative for Xinjiang should frame these changes as an opportunity for China to benefit and learn from the West's mistakes and from technical assistance and support to put its workforce management policies, indeed its development policies, on a more sustainable footing. We also situate this approach with reference to fairness in the international trading system. Recommendation 3 aims to address the growing problem of supply chain bifurcation. Import bans stop goods made with forced labor coming in, but they don't prevent the firms that make those goods from trading, even in that same country. As a result, those firms can charge premiums to consumers for supply of slavery-free goods, and then use those premiums to fund continued use of forced labor to make goods for other markets. So import bans may end up cutting the connection between Western consumers and forced labor, but not necessarily preventing forced labor. We explore a solution, shifting greater focus in sanctions to entities' operations as a whole, not just to their goods. Recommendation 4 offers other ideas for strengthening target selection. Again, as I said, one of the big surprises of our study is that targets don't appear to have been selected based on vulnerability or influence, the key factors that sanctions theory tells us matter. Instead, they seem to have been selected based on the available evidence of ties to forced labor. And one unexpected result is that in some cases, such as solar, those sanctions may actually hurt Western actors more than they hurt the targets. We lay out ideas for changing this dynamic, including a greater focus on firms tied directly to Beijing and leveraging the strengths of different countries in the sanctioning coalition, rather than having all countries sanction exactly the same targets. In recommendation 5, we talk about capital markets. Xinjiang is simply not a highly export-dependent region. Only around 10% of GDP comes from exports. It is, however, investment dependent. Beijing works actively to attract both Chinese and foreign capital to Xinjiang, and it's succeeding in doing that. Western investors are arguably financing the forced labor-fueled growth of Xinjiang. Now, sanctions theory tells us that we're likely to have a bigger impact on the scarce factor of production, and in Xinjiang, that's capital. Western sanctions basically don't touch this yet. Major institutional investors such as Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, UBS, and JP Morgan Chase hold investments in firms that have been reported to have connections to Xinjiang forced labor. 90% of FDI into Xinjiang in recent years has gone to the mining sector, and that's largely untouched by Xinjiang sanctions at this point. If Western capitals are serious about using sanctions to prevent forced labor, they need to consider expanding sanctions to investment in sectors in Xinjiang that are highly dependent on capital investment, such as fossil fuels, chemicals, and energy. We lay out some ideas on this, including mandatory disclosure and due diligence rules. Sanctions are more likely to succeed if backed by a large number of states with significant leverage, and at present, the Xinjiang Sanctions Coalition is quite small. Xinjiang sanctions will have little overall effect if China can simply reallocate trade of Xinjiang forced labor goods to other markets. Indeed, China is actively expanding free trade ties between Xinjiang and countries in Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The sanctioning coalition should counter this by recruiting countries whose producers and exporters stand to lose from Chinese social dumping of Xinjiang forced labor goods. That includes, as I mentioned, cotton producers in Central Asia, tomato producers and processors in West Africa and Latin America, and polysilicon producers in South Korea. In recommendation 7, we lay out a variety of ideas on strengthening the basis, process of adoption and enforcement of import bans, which I'll let you read about more in Policy Brief 10. Recommendation 8 deals with the costs of compliance of sanctions. Debates currently tend to downplay those costs of compliance beyond the cost for importers, when in fact they include increased prices for consumers, loss of market share in China for Western firms operating there, and risks to personnel. No government has specific policies in place to support firms incurring these costs or to address consumer price increases. And those gaps risk eroding confidence in and support for these policies if left unaddressed. So we propose steps that governments might take to address this, including information sharing, trade facilitation, and export credit support, cooperation with online media platforms, and industrial policy, critically, to develop slavery-free supply chains. To date, Xinjiang sanctions have done little to provide or enable remedy for victims of Xinjiang forced labor. So in recommendation 9, we explore some of the options. It's obviously difficult to provide remedy within Xinjiang itself, but there is scope to explore options for preserving evidence for future accountability or for support to Uyghur diaspora groups. Emerging best practice suggests that the adequacy of remediation should in fact be determined in consultation with relevant stakeholders like those groups and victim and community representatives and international trade unions. We explore some of the options. Finally, in recommendation 10, we look at coordination. There's been limited coordination within the sanctioning coalition to date, mainly around target selection, business guidance, and announcement of sanctions. In our final recommendation, we discuss other areas where coordination could be strengthened, as you see here on the screen, including everything from information sharing, mutual recognition, remedy to industrial policy. If Xinjiang sanctions are to work, meaning to prevent and remedy forced labor, then these are the kinds of steps that will need to be taken to strengthen sanctions design and implementation. We hope you find the materials on the website useful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, James. That was fantastic. I think it is possible actually to group all of the questions that we've had so far into one single brief answer, and you'll see yourself, James, in the Q&A section, that they're really about what investors, financial institutions, property and procurement managers questions should be. What should they be trying to do to support sanctions on entities and goods? What advice would you give companies who want to comply with import bans, who don't necessarily understand everything you've just said about bifurcation and reputational harms? What would be your key takeaways for those companies?
Thanks, Zoe. Yeah, this is a critical question. And obviously a lot of what we've just talked about is really directed at governments, but has relevance to business. In a nutshell, business needs to do two things at this point. First of all, they really need to get to know their own value chains, their supply chains in particular, but there may also be other aspects of their value chains where capital is coming from or where they're investing that are relevant here. And secondly, they need to be listening to each other, to relevant civil society stakeholders and to government. And I use the word listening, but it really is going to be about dialogue. These kinds of issues are not going to be solved by individual companies, by individual investors. They're not even going to be solved by individual governments. It's going to take a systemic shift to address this challenge. And that is a pretty new and different way of doing things. We're seeing that happen on Russia, as I mentioned. So there may be lessons that can be drawn from that experience. But one of the key lessons there is working together, sharing information, sharing experiences, and taking a precautionary approach, really making sure that you're being risk conscious and risk averse in your approach to these issues.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That does address the questions we've had, and we are now out of time. So let me just thank you, James, on behalf of everyone, and thank our attendees for coming. Please do have a look at the website. The URL again is behind us here, and we hope you find it useful. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.